So this is Manish Tapkara. I'm from Enking International. We are one of the world's largest carbon credit project developer based at India. While we do have 150 plus team members based at 18 plus nations and 2500 plus clients at 40 plus nations. So now I request Ogus to kindly take over and take it forward. Thank you.
For your introduction. As Manish Dapkara, Mr. Dapkara said, Enking International is one of the world's leading carbon consulting company. So today we are proud to have a discussion with respectful representatives of respectful organizations on such an important issue, which is the carbonization of the aviation industry. As of now, Corsia could be, considered as the only market-based tool, and it has several pros and cons, both in terms of technically and, at a application level. So this discussion today, this panel, I hope that will be contributing to understand more of its dynamics, more of its basics, along with the pros and cons which were already mentioned. So I don't want to steal too much of your time, and in this respect I would like to give the floor Hugh Salvey from Gold Standard. The floor is yours, Hugh. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having us here today. I think it is an important discussion to have, so we're really glad to have it. So my name's Hugh Salway. I'm Head of Environmental Markets at Gold Standard, which is one of the standards serving the carbon market, so the voluntary carbon market, but also Corsia, as I'll talk about today. Corsia, just taking a step back before I go into Gold Standard's work on it, creates strange incentives in a way where ultimately, if Corsia is most successful, credits won't be bought because that means that you won't have had an increase in aviation emissions above 2020 levels. So it kind of creates odd incentives in a way, Corsia. But it's an interesting scheme, and I think actually one of the things that we found kind of interesting over the past year is the fact that Corsia eligibility in the market has kind of become a benchmark in its own right for the voluntary carbon market. And I think that's been useful. So the existence of Corsia has in a way created a kind of understanding of what quality represents in the voluntary market, for better or worse, but it's kind of created that, which has been interesting to see. So Gold Standard is one of the standards which is recognized under Corsia. So the way that this works for anyone who's not so familiar is there are a set of standards, carbon market programs, which are recognized as eligible for its units to be used for compliance with Corsia. And Gold Standard's one of those recognized standards alongside Vera, ACR, CAR, GCC, CDM at the moment, and I may have missed one, but I think that's about right. And how this works as a standard is we were given eligibility with certain conditions which were applied to that. So for us at the moment, our eligibility runs through the voluntary piloting phase at first, so from 2021 to 2023 for the compliance cycle. There are particular vintage restrictions on units which applied kind of across the board to all standards when this was put in place. So only for activities that started their first crediting period from 1st January 2016, and for emission reductions that occurred up to the end of December 2020. And I'll come on to that in a bit and the reasons for that. And then for us, as for other standards, particular kind of activity type or credit type restrictions which were put in place. And one of the things that we've been doing on our side since we received eligibility is updating our registry to make sure that this can work in practice. So as of the past couple of days, you can now in the Gold Standard registry see the projects which have Corsia eligible credits, and then see the credits themselves which are eligible under Corsia, so those that meet the eligibility criteria. So this exists in our registry. And this kind of tracking is one component of what's there in our registry. Other components are making sure that units can be retired for the specific purpose of Corsia compliance, that's transparent in the registry, so you're able to see which credits have been retired for the purpose of Corsia. and also making sure that that can only be done by airlines or by account holders acting on behalf of airlines. So there's registry updates that we've been making to make sure that Corsia can be implemented in practice and that there's security over airlines wanting to retire the right credits. So this is what we've been doing over the past year or so. And then one of the next steps in our work as a standard for Corsia is looking at the eligibility of credits for vintages after 2020. And as you can see on the top left here, one of the criterion which ICAO has for Corsia eligible credits is the avoidance of double counting. So that's the avoidance of double issuance of credits, double use of credits, but also double claiming of credits with NDCs. And so Article 6, the negotiations which are going on at the moment, are quite relevant for this, and what Article 6 says about the use of credits and the transfer of credits for use in Corsia. And so on the right here, this is just to kind of illustrate what we're doing at the moment is consulting on a new process that we'll put in place to make sure that we can manage double claiming between NDCs and Corsia. So a process by which we can receive letters of authorization from host countries saying they won't count emission reductions towards their NDC and that they can be uniquely claimed in Corsia. And there's a consultation that we're running right now on this process, so the mechanics of how we'll manage this. And then once we've had, hopefully, an outcome on Article 6 over the next couple of days, we will make sure that our process is aligned with that outcome, and we will, over the next couple of months, introduce this process into our system. And what that means in practice, we hope, is that gold standard credits with vintages after 2020 will be eligible for either the current phase of Corsia or for future phases of Corsia. And this is something that we expect all standards to be doing over the, I don't know what the time frame is, but over the foreseeable future. And it's something that as standards we want to try to have some kind of level of consistency in our approach on. So a couple of years ago, the standards were all involved in a process together to look at the avoidance of double counting for Corsia. And there were some kind of principles and requirements which came out of that, which we're reflecting on our own process. So I think kind of through these three slides, I wanted to share different steps really for gold standard as a standard which is eligible for Corsia. So the initial approval, what happened there, the work we've done over the past year to update our registry, make sure that this can functionally work, people can buy gold standard credits for use in Corsia, and that can be reported through the system. And then the next phase of our work in looking at the eligibility of credits after 2020 and how we manage this double claiming issue of NDCs. And so this for us is going to be the next important piece of work. And that's what I wanted to share for now. So thanks very much for having us, and I'll pass over to the next speaker.
Yeah, thank you, Hugh, for these clarifications on the upcoming issues regarding Corsia eligibility and its tech. Welcome, Jill, by the way. So we will be discussing further on this via our questions. The next speech will be coming from Stefan Donofrio from Ecosystem Marketplace, which is a Foresterans initiative. So the floor is yours, Stefan. We would like to hear more on voluntary carbon market and its transactions recently. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I think it's still morning. It's my last day here at COP. Very much feel like this has been a very, very important COP for so many different reasons, understanding where the carbon market, especially the voluntary market and the intersection of voluntary and compliance markets such as Corsia, really do come together. Just a little bit about Ecosystem Marketplace and to set the context. So what we are doing in the carbon markets, what we've been doing for the last 16 years, is to have organizations from around the world report their confidential data of their sales, the traded carbon credits, for voluntary or compliance purposes, and they could be originating from independent standards or from compliance standards, into our centralized repository so that we can consolidate the entire market information that is covering all prices and all the additional attributes associated with the project, such as the co-benefits, sustainable development goals. And what we did for this year as we led into our reporting cycle was we increase some of the metrics that we were asking organizations for. One of those that was most important for being able to achieve the goal of tagging prices and information as Corsia eligible was about the project ID. So that is important for us in order for the respondents to provide with their trades the actual project IDs that are associated with that, not just the project type or the location they're coming from, because that allows us to then map all of these trades back to the registries from the standards that exist. We have the largest system of trades being reported to us from a global network of over 170, now closer to 180 market participants located in 40 countries where their headquarters are, but the projects that they're reporting are from over 80 countries. So it is a comprehensive database, and we're continuously building upon this. A couple of other data points which we've increased and this will all help to inform, assessments such as Corsia eligible pricing and market activity, is also asking for the end buyer information. And there's increasing calls for us to build more end-to-end market transparency. So I'll talk about that maybe later. We just put out these numbers yesterday to show that the market is continuing to move. So since we launched our first installment of 2021 data in September, showing that the market was on the verge of getting to $1 billion. This is the voluntary carbon market for the first time ever in a given calendar year. Since then, we tracked 59 million, roughly, new trades, and that brings the market value for the voluntary market over $1 billion. Now, this is particularly data for what is coming from either compliance or independent standards used for voluntary purposes. Now, we also have data which we have not yet reported through a partnership with ICAO, where we are going to start reporting Corsia eligible prices and volumes broken down at this level, but also at the project category level and additional analysis. And while I can't put it up here because we're still finalizing some of the details, we are waiting on the registries, as Hugh just said. It was this week that they finalized, the registry update at gold standard. Vera is doing the same. Once that is all complete, we will be able to activate our reporting publicly to be able to show Corsia eligible prices. But just to give you a sense, when we look at some of these project categories, and maybe I'll go to the next slide. So these are some of the main project categories, renewable energy, forestry and land use, energy efficiency, agriculture, waste disposal, household devices, which are cook stoves, and transportation. So, but just to give a sample, and we'll give you a little bit of a range here, so I'm not going to be too held to some of these numbers, but just to give a sense, for some of the main categories, forestry and land use, household devices, renewable energy, the 2020 transactions that we were tracking for Corsia eligibility, the range of price increase for Corsia eligible credits over the benchmark of all credits reported to us was anywhere between 150 to 350% higher for Corsia eligible credits than non-Corsia eligible credits. There's a very interesting I guess, nuance with energy efficiency and fuel switching, where that number is even higher, 1,000+% higher for Corsia eligible credits than non-Corsia eligible credits. The volumes, of course, are much lower. So tracking around 4 million, 5 million tons of Corsia eligible credits in 2020 compared to, the 700 the 400 or so, if you go back to this slide. So, the roughly 300 million tons of all voluntary carbon market traded activity. So volumes are lower, prices are a lot higher, but this is to the point of trying to create some very clear eligibility guidelines about the project start date and first crediting period cannot be before 2016. And, you set these guidelines, and it does shrink then the potential supply of tradable credits. So that makes sense. And then, of course, from there, it's about making sure that, the quality of those credits is aligned with what international aviation is looking to achieve. And so when we look at these numbers for 2021, also the percentages are equally as high. For energy efficiency, not so high, but this, we also recognize that this is not a full calendar year of 2021 that we've tracked so far. Whereas all the way to December 31st, we'll continue to track. We won't have those final numbers until Q1 of next year, just because some of our respondents are reporting annually, others are reporting quarterly, others are monthly, others are weekly, some are reporting as trades are occurring. So we could be reporting these prices on a daily basis, but the prices don't move all that much on a day-to-day basis. But what I guess my main message here is that Corsia eligible credits are anywhere between 100% to 1,300% higher, depending on the project category, than non-Corsia eligible credits within those same project categories. So I'll leave it there as a takeaway. I won't go into the rest of the slides here because I think they're more focused on the voluntary market. But I guess my final kind of message and call for the market is that transparency is what will drive away skeptics. It's what will ensure that those that need to have the information to be able to assess the credibility of any market, whether it's a sector compliance market or it's a voluntary market, organizations that are active in those markets need to be reporting and be transparent about their activities in order for us to then consolidate that data, anonymize it, and then continue to be a credible source of market intelligence. And so we really appreciate NKing and others who have for a long time been reporting to us, and we have a lot more work to do, but really appreciate this opportunity to talk about Corsia today. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Corsia credits and its pricing is a big issue, very critical issue, by the way. I mean, personally, I would say that in Turkish market, the expectation for Corsia credits from the renewable energy industry players with issued volumes can be, way above than the actual market prices. And their expectation, I would say that to see even higher prices, higher rates than you have just mentioned. I mean, their expectation, I would say that 70 or 80 percent more pricing rate in the market. But personally, I don't expect such an increase, which actually recently we are kind of experiencing. But in several markets, I know that there is a scarcity regarding the issuances. Yes, we will see if the prices is still going, keeping a significant increase in the coming months as well. So thanks to Hugh and Stefan, we have discussed a very, we have gained a very important market view. So I would like to, listen more of critical, criticizing views from some NGO partners, event partners. The first representative is coming from United States of America as Stefan. She is representing Climate Exchange as policy officer, Noah Dalzell. The floor is yours. Thank you for your presentation in advance.
Awesome, thank you so much. And I'm just moving with this remote here. Awesome. So it's great to be here. My name is Noah Dalzell, and I'm the director of the State Climate Policy Network at Climate Exchange. This is a US-based state climate policy network, and we have a network of about 15,000 advocates, policymakers, business leaders, academics, all of whom are focused on advancing effective and equitable state-level climate policies. So we are really looking at a whole society approach to decarbonization and assessing the pathways forward to reducing emissions in each and every sector, including electricity, buildings, agriculture, and of course, transportation. So we're actually launching a policy dashboard that will be tracking the implemented state-level policies to reduce emissions across the US. So I encourage you all to check out our work. You can do so at climate-exchange.org. So as the other panelists have shared today, and as the rest of the panelists I'm sure will continue to, regardless of where you are in the world and what part of the climate space you work in, decarbonizing aviation is an enormous challenge. The decarbonization rallying cry has been electrify everything. When it comes to aviation, it's unfortunately not that simple. Emissions from air travel are growing, and by 2050, it is very possible that flight emissions will account for more than a quarter of the entire allotted global carbon budget if we are to avert the worst impacts of the climate crisis. So this is something that we need to address, and this is something that we need to step up in all regards, and that's what I'll be talking a little bit more about today, as well as the U.S. efforts to decarbonize the sector, very fitting as yesterday was Transportation Day here at COP. So in the U.S., aviation represents 11% of transportation-related emissions. That's pretty notable because transportation is, the largest source of emissions in the United States. So we have a lot of conversation around this. A lot of the rhetoric centers around expanding public transit access, electrifying vehicles, and usually, we will talk about those incentives and those programs. We just passed a pretty big infrastructure bill that talks about some of these things. But aviation is usually an asterisk in that conversation. It's that really difficult component, so it's not the one that usually dominates the narrative, but it's one that we have to address and prioritize if we are to reach our targets. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Corsia. I don't work directly on this program as some of the other panelists do, so I just wanted to note that. But this offsetting program was adopted by the United Nations in 2016. And I want to note that in our perspective, we need to go much, much further than Corsia in order to effectively and truly decarbonize aviation and to incentivize that kind of mass action. So that goes for any other difficult to abate industry. I think it was Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg yesterday. I sort of followed him around yesterday in his transportation events. He said these hard to abate sectors are must abate sectors. So simply paying for the reduction of emissions elsewhere is not going to be enough, particularly not in adherence to relatively weak reduction goals that are set by Corsia. For the first 6 years of the program, it's voluntary. ICAO does not have the legal capacity to ensure compliance, and countries are not going to have to offset until 2026. And even when they do, that price point is going to be pretty low. So we need to ensure the environmental integrity of offsets. I'm glad that we have people on this panel and others in the space that are working hard to do that. But it does remain challenging. Offsets have to be additional. They have to be permanent. They have to be correctly estimated. As much as we've tried in the past, this has all been difficult to ensure. So I just want to stress that we're not here, we can't hedge all of our decarbonization bets on just this market. So while there are monitoring, enforcement, and verification measures in place, ensuring that these measures are sufficient is going to be a priority of this program and an enormous challenge. And again, I'm not going to go too much into the nitty-gritty details around fuel types and technologies that are available and are not available to transform the sector, but I do want to note that we need unprecedented financial investment in new technologies and a rapid deployment strategy for the existing ones if we're going to transform the sector at the scale needed to avert the worst impacts of this crisis. So I'll talk a little bit about what the U.S. is doing right now. In addition to what was included, so first of all, yes, in September we had this September executive action by the Biden administration. So yesterday when I was here at COP, at Transportation Day, I was lucky to attend a number of aviation-focused events talking about the decarbonization of the sector. So yesterday was the launch of the International Aviation Climate Ambition Coalition between 20 countries, of which the U.S. is a part of. There was also a great, robust conversation at the U.S. Center between non-governmental actors, including the leaders of United Airlines, Amazon, Alaska Airlines, and some of the other key players in the private sector in this space. So a little bit of context to that, in September, President Joe Biden announced an executive action to advance the future of sustainable aviation fuels in American aviation. So because it's an executive action, it's not legally binding, but it's important because it does lay out America's intent. And America's intent, according to this action, is a goal of reducing aviation emissions by 20% by 2030 when compared to business as usual. So there are a couple of notable components to this executive action that I'll briefly touch on. First and foremost is the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Tax Credit. This is a part of that $1.75 trillion Build Back Better package that I'm sure we've all been hearing about. It's the massive spending bill kind of awaiting passage right now in Congress. And members of Congress have said here in the halls of COP that this is going to pass, but it's important to note that this tax credit survives the next cut and actually makes it into law. That's something that United Airlines CEO actually stressed yesterday is a huge policy priority for him. What this tax credit does is provide $1.25 per gallon of SAF blended with traditional jet fuel, so long as there's a 50% reduction in life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. So that's really important because right now just 0.01% of global jet fuel is SAF. The executive action also announced the launch of the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Grant Challenge. That's a multi-agency collaboration between the Department of Energy, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Agriculture to initiate a government-wide grant challenge focused on research and development for SAF pathways. So that research and development is going to remain critically important. The U.S. has promised to invest $4.3 billion in funding into this. And the ultimate goal is to inspire the dramatic increase in SAF to at least 3 billion gallons by 2030 in the U.S. And for context, that 3 billion is really ambitious considering the fact that in 2019, only 2.4 million gallons of jet fuel in the U.S. were produced. So that's really a dramatic increase, very ambitious, and we'll need a little bit more detail around that. And there's a number of other provisions, including federal grants for the Aviation Sustainability Center, the launch of the Sustainable Flight National Partnership, specific industry commitments and efforts to improve air traffic and airport efficiency, among other commitments. So I'll just add, yesterday there was a major announcement here that the U.S. government announced its Aviation Climate Action Plan. So this sets an even more ambitious goal, net zero emissions for the sector by 2050, and it delineates several key policy areas, priority areas for the government. So in addition to promoting the use of sustainable aviation fuels, the government will develop more efficient aircraft technology and engine technologies, launch a series of airport decarbonization efforts, including zero-emission vehicle program, which will provide grants for airports to electrify its vehicles. It will explore electrification and potentially hydrogen for short-haul flights, continue to play a leadership role in ICAO, strengthen Corsia's ambition to ensure the integrity and transparency of emission reductions. And yesterday, the launch of this event, and the launch of the International Aviation Climate Ambition Coalition, I really like a quote by Brad Shallert of the World Wildlife Foundation, who said, "We need every tool at our disposal to cut emissions. That includes efficiency measures, operational measures, SAF, and reducing overall demand for aviation." And I wanted to quote that because that component is important, and it's not one we like to discuss in this space. But it's important. It's part of why it's important that we improve high-speed rail and other alternative transportation modes whenever possible. And it's obviously not, a lot of us flew here to get to COP, and there wasn't an alternative transportation mode. But I just wanted to mention that sometimes it is possible, and we just need better infrastructure and investments in place. So in closing, I want to leave you all with this. We know that we cannot afford technology to be frozen in place. Luckily, it never seems to. But in the case that it does, the emissions of the U.S. aviation industry would be projected to double by 2050 from their 2019 levels. So that's just to show how important it is that we really, really invest in this in a transformational way. So the U.S. needs to lead with significant investments, mass deployment, and not just follow the market signal set by Corsia, but go much further than that to meet the scale of this challenge. Next year at the ICAO assembly, countries will be able to adopt a long-term emission reduction target for this sector, for reductions that aligns with Paris. And this is going to be a real test for American ambition in this space. Commercial aviation has become more efficient, but as the planet warms and as demand for flying continues to increase, we need to step up our game and commitment to decarbonizing this sector. American leaders have been really big on saying, America's all in, America's back. In order to really be all in, the U.S. must lead the way in decarbonizing the sector, so I'm calling on our leaders to not punt this issue down the road, treat this as we have solar and wind and other technologies, while these markets take form, to make sure that we're really meeting the scale of this challenge. So thank you so much, and it's really great to be here.
Thank you, Noah, for this dynamic presentation, I would say. I mean, I have not been reading too much on the decarbonization efforts in U.S. aviation industry. And of course, the recent issues, the recent gossips, I couldn't have time to follow. It was quite helpful for me to address some of, existing and recent issues. Thank you very much for your presentation. Having said that, NGO perception on the decarbonization of aviation industry, I would like to also give the floor Jill Dufresne, representing Carbon Market Watch, for a further discussion regarding the implementation of Corsia. Yeah, the floor is yours. Can we have the mic?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. Sorry.
No. You are not going to use.
No, I don't have any slides. Yeah, thank you. So sorry for being a bit late, but I arrived during Hugh's interesting presentation about what Gold Standard is doing to adapt to the rules of Corsia and making sure that the registry and their credits are ready to be used by airlines, and then also Stephen's presentation about what are the dynamics in the voluntary market and what is the state of the voluntary market, and to what extent is it ready to supply units to Corsia. I think that is definitely a really important perspective, ensuring that the quality of the credits that will be used on the Corsia is sufficient, and that this will be a system that can actually work from the, let's say, the carbon market side. What I want to talk about a bit more is more on the Corsia side of things. What is Corsia as a policy? What does it do? What doesn't it do? And how did we come to this? So how was Corsia established and why? I think I would very much agree with the previous speaker that Corsia is not fit for purpose. It is not going to be enough to address the climate impact of the aviation sector, and that is very clear. Corsia is not a carbon pricing tool. As a carbon pricing tool, it is basically set up for failure, since it is established on the logic of offsetting and compensating your emissions. So by the logic of that, you are, by definition, going to find the cheapest emission reductions you can find, the cheapest emission reductions that are eligible on the Corsia, and so you are going towards the cheaper reductions, which mean the lower carbon price. So the idea of compensating emissions does not lend itself well to actually setting a carbon price that incentivizes domestic or inside sector, within the sector, abatement. So that's just a first point. And then on the functioning of Corsia, I mean, we talk a lot about this basic idea that, airlines are going to have to offset their emissions. That's true, that's what Corsia does. But it's really important to look at the details and what are they going to have to offset. Corsia only addresses international aviation emissions, so this leaves out a very large share of global aviation emissions, which are domestic. If you think about larger countries like China or Russia or the US, there are a lot of emissions that take place domestically and which are not addressed by Corsia. Crucially, it also only addresses CO2 emissions, which only represent a portion of the climate impact of aviation. Aviation has quite complex interactions with the atmosphere, and its overall impact is much larger than just its CO2 emissions. So there was a relatively recent study published by the European Commission, done by the European Aviation Safety Agency, that found that the non-CO2 effects are basically twice the CO2 effects. So when I say it covers only CO2, it's not like covering 90% and leaving out 10%. It's actually a very large share of the climate impact of aviation that is not covered. Third, Corsia only covers the growth. I think that's sometimes not emphasized enough, but that makes a massive difference in what is covered. Aviation emissions are growing, but they are quite high already today. And so what Corsia does is basically say all the emissions we have until now, up to the baselines, which is set at 2019 levels, we're basically doing nothing about those. You can just keep those emissions. You don't even need to offset them. And we're just going to address the growth in emissions. If you take all of these factors and apply them to European aviation, just as an example, it means Corsia is going to cover about 6% of airline CO2 emissions. So covering only the growth, not covering domestic flights. So this is really honestly a quite meaningless policy. I struggle to describe Corsia as a climate policy. It really addresses a very small share of emissions, and those emissions that are addressed by offsetting, which I think is a very risky strategy. I don't think all the offsets out there are worthless. I think there are good projects, there are good credits, but there are also a lot of bad ones, and essentially assuming that every credit represents a ton of CO2 is a very risky strategy. Instead of really reducing your emissions, where you're taking one ton of CO2 out, you're just buying the credits and then basically crossing your fingers, hoping that it's really a ton of CO2. So that's quite an important point. I just want to talk also a bit about how did we come to this? Why do we have Corsia? Why don't we have a stronger aviation? Why don't we have stronger legislation to cover the climate impact of aviation? And I think one of the big issues here is that we're actually trying to regulate this under ICAO, so the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is the UN body in charge of aviation. ICAO has been existing for a while now, and only relatively recently started dealing with the climate impacts of aviation. ICAO's mission has historically been to drive harmonization and security within the aviation sector, and in that also to promote growth and continued activity in the aviation sector. And basically, I think one of their taglines is like helping to connect the world, which is great, you know, it's great to connect the world, but I think it is an agency that is not really fit for purpose when it comes to reducing the climate impacts of aviation, which does require to some extent to look at the demand reductions and less flying. ICAO is also an incredibly opaque organization. I don't know if any of you has ever tried to get information about what is happening at ICAO outside of media reports. It is quite difficult. We are working with a few other NGOs as part of working groups within ICAO, and we have tried a lot to make this organization more transparent, and we had a big success. You know, we got the agendas of meetings to be public, I think 2 years ago. So honestly, for me, having to say that it's a success to have the agenda of meetings public is really, I mean, I feel really bad about this. I think all the documents should be public, the content of what is being discussed. This is not some, you know, very sensitive business discussion. It's countries, it's governments that represent us as citizens who are talking about the future of the aviation sector and how to regulate its climate impacts. And all of this is happening behind closed doors, and even journalists do not have access to ICAO. ICAO has even been blocking climate scientists on Twitter, saying that they are too critical and spreading fake news. So they have really gone to great lengths to be seen as a very opaque organization. But we do have other processes, right, to address the climate impact of various sectors, and this is exactly what we're doing in these halls at this COP. We have governments coming together under the UNFCCC at COPs every year, trying to address the climate, to address various climate impacts and reducing our global emissions. The Paris Agreement clearly states that NDCs must strive to be economy-wide. Economy-wide means including all the sectors. It should include aviation. It should include international aviation. We need to tackle with this problem under the UN body that is tackling international climate policies, and not deal with this at ICAO, which is too opaque and too corporate captured. There is a review of Corsia that is planned in 2022 and then in subsequent years as well. And there has been some hope placed by some countries and some stakeholders to say, yeah, you know, we recognize Corsia is very weak today, but actually we're going to strengthen it. There is this review, we can make it better. I think that's very illusory, and if you look at the discussions that are taking place, the main points of discussion for the review of Corsia are we going to make Corsia even weaker than it is? And one of the major items are, how do we deal with the baseline? So the baseline above which emissions have to be offset. This baseline was originally set at the average of 2019 and 2020 emissions. But of course, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, aviation emissions dropped. And so the baseline would have been much lower, which would have increased the quantity of offsets that are required by airlines. And so a decision was taken last year to change the baseline for the pilot phase, and basically thereby lowering the amount of offsets that airlines have to purchase, which means that until 2025, around 2025, maybe 2024, 2026, we don't know, but around 25, that's when airlines will start having to purchase anything. So Corsia is starting now, but airlines don't have to cancel anything at the moment because they are not emitting above the baseline. And so one of the things being discussed for the Corsia review is whether or not we need to extend this exemption for the baseline and continue with this lower baseline even beyond the pilot phase. So the review is really shaping up to be a discussion about how can we make this ridiculously weak scheme even weaker. And so I don't have much faith in increasing the ambition of Corsair. So to close off, just want to highlight again what Corsair does not do. Corsair doesn't price emissions adequately. It doesn't cover the non-CO2 impacts of aviation. It doesn't cover most of the CO2 emissions since it focuses only on the growth. It addresses only the national emissions. And also importantly, it fails to set a long-term goal. We have this short-term objective of compensating the growth of aviation emissions, but we really don't have a long-term goal for the aviation sector at ICAO. And you know who has a long-term goal? It's the aviation industry. So the aviation industry is actually going beyond what ICAO is doing. And I think that's a logic we've seen repeating, where the aviation industry, whether it's IATA or Airlines for Europe, are adopting targets and supporting measures which are then adopted by ICAO. And so if ICAO adopts a long-term goal next year or the year after, I think it would be very interesting to see if they manage to adopt anything that goes beyond what the industry has already adopted on a voluntary basis. So I will close with that. I will just, a very last point on this idea of how the public regulation, whether it's through ICAO or whether it's through voluntary or whether it's through national action, is combined with voluntary action from airlines. You see a lot of airlines that are making pledges that they will be net zero, that they are offsetting all of their emissions. And one kind of framing that I think is really important to keep in mind and to fight against is this idea that the private sector, in this case, the aviation sector and airlines, are stepping in to plug the hole left by the public sector. That basically governments are failing to regulate us, are failing to regulate the aviation sector, and therefore airlines are stepping up and adopting these voluntary commitments. This is very misleading because the same airlines who are stepping up to adopt voluntary commitments are also heavily investing and lobbying against government policies. So you have one company on the one hand, they're lobbying to say, yeah, don't regulate us, don't include us under your carbon tax, don't include us under your emissions trading system. This is gonna, you're just trying to make money for the government, it's not gonna be good for the climate, etc. And then they will take voluntary action by voluntary offsets and claim that they are going beyond what the governments are failing to do. So they're basically plugging a hole that they have dug themselves. And I think that's really important to keep in mind when we look at what the aviation sector is doing today. I realize this was not a very positive presentation of the aviation industry or of Corsia, but I'm afraid that for Corsia I don't have much positive things to say.
Thank you, Jill, for this very detailed presentation, and I would say that you have very well prepared. Thank you for this effort, first of all. And I would also say that I have some similar concerns with you, but I am still discussing, in a positive way that I think Corsia is a carbon pricing mechanism, but we have, of course, several things to be solved, but I don't know if they are open to be solved or not. Let's see. So the last speaker is coming from ESPR, which is a leading carbon auditing company in the world. He's a very close friend of mine, and I really appreciate his expertise in this area. Maybe some answer for improving Corsia would be coming from him. Mr. Arshit Stritasava, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can I use your laptop to look at the presentation?
Yeah.
Can I look at your laptop to look at the
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Oguz Bey. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. This is your captain speaking. After a little bit of inclement weather, we have cleared the skies. Sit back, relax, grab a drink or whatever. Let's get this flight started from a hard-hitting facts perspective. I represent Earthhood Services Private Limited. Just to give you a brief context, we are into auditing, and we started off in 2012-13. Done more than 2,000 projects by now across programs like CDM, VCS, GS, GCC, which has just come up and which is also Corsair compliant. Just to add to your thoughts over there, yeah, and yeah, going forward, we are also looking at new plans for the forestry and Afalu sector with Plan Vivo, and yeah, so. I must say that we are at the cusp of something big, and we are at a point where decisions have to be taken now, action has to be done, and the point of no return is not that far from us. Everything said and done, there's been a lot of history that has gone around with the Corsia scheme. They took so much of time to come up with everything, but now that they have, so it's at least a start in the international aviation sector, which was much required, and yeah, so just getting ready for the facts that I'm about to present in the later slides. I wanted to put some things into context. That the NDCs, for example, India's NDCs and the recent declaration that they made that they will be carbon neutral by 2070. So some people have not received that very well as well, but going forward, the NDCs and all the aspects of the mechanisms need to be taken into due consideration, even if this is for just the Corsia scheme or for any other scheme. So we have to put together and propagate a healthy and sustainable way of living, and going forward we have to adopt a climate-friendly and a cleaner path. These are all the basic indices that have been given out by the government of India. For example, they want to reduce the intensity of its GDP by 33 to 35% by 2030 from the levels of 2005. And switching over to the fossil fuels is switching over to the renewable energy instead of relying on the fossil fuels is much required. India plans to achieve about 40% of the cumulative electricity installed capacity from non-fossil fuel-based energy sources by 2030. There's also a need to create a carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent by increasing the forest cover by 2030. Investments need to flow. They are much required. Carbon finance is still required. Some people argue about the additionality, and some people argue about the need for carbon finance for special kind of projects. But yes, we cannot have a blanket, or we cannot have a umbrella approval, so to say, for any particular kind of project, because a renewable energy project in Nigeria may not be additional in itself, and the one in US may be. So going forward, we need to mobilize the domestic and new and additional funds from developed countries to implement the mentioned plans. Capacity building is something which is very important, and I'm sure, Ouz, you are taking good measures with the other countries bilaterally to develop more on the capacities and impart training and development to the nations, so that all in all, the growth can be sustainable and the recovery can be made. Just to give you a snapshot about the Indian scenario, so with the NDCs that have been communicated, and the need to raise the ambition is even more. India is kind of compatible with the 2 degrees targets, but to get to 1.5 degrees as per the Paris Agreement goals, they have to do a lot more, and this is something where, if you look at the graph, so the post-COVID-19 current policies which have been announced, they have been on the rise in terms of the climate action tracker. So the projections and the assumptions in the near future are going to be very interesting to watch out for. For any country, the runway for achieving carbon neutrality has to be take action and then stop and check and then take a stock take of whatever the implementation has been done, and then revise the ambitions, raise the ambitions, and communicate new NDCs. And this has to be kept done regularly over a period of time so that you can achieve carbon neutrality by the years that you have actually communicated that for. Now, Corsia, yeah, like I said, they took a lot of time to develop everything, and once they have launched the pilot phase, which is up to 2023, now similar thing goes for Corsia as well. Like my friends mentioned that they would like to see more, they would like to hear more from this scheme, and raising the ambition is kind of the need of the hour when they cross the pilot phase and enter the first phase, which will be in 2024. So just to give you a perspective why the aviation industry is so important, they account for approximately 12% of the overall emissions, and I'm presenting this data of 2019, which is pre-COVID era. So more than 915 million tons of emissions were there, and the humans produced over 43 billion tons of CO2 emissions. We carried 4.5 billion passengers in 2019. And that's how, in 2019, aviation was responsible for more than 12% of emissions overall. These aircrafts are operating at an efficiency level of 80% from what they were in 1960. This is a rosy picture to paint, but yes, having come across a long way, there is a lot of work to be done on the efficiency of the aircrafts and the dumping of the fuel on the airway. So that is also something which needs to be looked at rather seriously. If aviation was a country, then it would have ranked 20th in the world basis the annual GDP of more than $700 billion. Now, we are here. We're doing our bit. We are communicating our research. We are communicating our data. We are presenting our facts. And I'm sure the negotiators are doing a good job over there as well. We'll probably get to hear something in the next couple of days. As I understand, most of these square brackets have been resolved, and only the most crucial ones remain as of now. Things are moving, yes, but a lot has been done. And there needs to be, we have more to do, and more than ever. So we have to take a step and recognize what kind of steps have been taken already. So in 2020, September, all the outbound flights from European Union, they charge 17 euro cents per ticket for long-haul flights. That is actually cheaper than a coffee that you buy at the airport. And I keep saying this a lot of times that sustainability and getting to net zero, it's not costly. It's just the way you should look at it, and it's the way one should present the cases. The cycle of activities for any kind of carbon neutral claims remain the same for any kind of industry. You measure, you reduce, you offset, you report, and then you audit. And that's how you keep revisiting the facts over and over again so that you can actually be on a path of continual improvement. Like you mentioned, these are the few mechanisms which are available which are Corsia eligible, so to say. And it's just a snapshot of, I mean, most of the people already know. I'll end this slide, I'll end this presentation with a final thought that the time to act is now, and we need to do more than ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Arshit, for your presentation. So we are done with the speeches, and I would like to, open a common ground for the questions and answer session. I have personally a few questions for speakers, but as I have done in the previous events, I would like to prioritize our attendees, our audience, if they have any questions regarding the implementation of Corsia, nature of Corsia, or pros and cons on the same. So we would like to welcome you if you have any question. Mr. Singh from ESPL.
Hi, it's Kavi from ESPL. So I've got a question for Stephen. You talked about the different numbers of the voluntary carbons which are being traded, and I was able to figure out that mostly forestry and renewable credits are the one which are leading. So especially when gold standard and Vera has phased out the new renewable energy credits, how do you see going forward in terms of demand? Because almost 30% of the credits will be out sometime soon. So how it's going to impact the demand, especially when the prices are already going out of the roof?
Yeah, as you mentioned, the demand is already shifting in a very significant way towards forestry and land use projects, and we're seeing more activity in agriculture than we have historically, specifically on changing agricultural farming practices and rangeland practices. I guess Hugh could probably talk to it more from a standard perspective on exactly how the rules will shape out for projects that are existing in developed economies, how much longer they can issue credits for from the renewable energy side, and what the phase-out period might be for LDCs. But we're currently still seeing high volumes for renewable energy. It's just the lower prices, and it's not for us, and when we look at it, it's not so much an issue about the value of carbon. I think or that carbon isn't valued, but the other attributes of forestry projects are valued more, and valued in a way where there's stacking elements of how you price these credits and what they're worth to companies in order to achieve not only climate goals, but other sustainable development goals. If the project's rich with biodiversity conservation and wetlands and mangrove projects that have multiple benefits. So I think we're still waiting to see the drop off of renewable energy, but at the same time, other project categories, when you look at the registry data of what's being issued, transportation projects are, they're a smaller line item, but in terms of percentage increase from last year to this year, the past few years, skyrocketing in terms of new available supply of transportation credits. But forestry is leading the way, mostly because in some ways projects can achieve high volumes in an individual project level. So it's an opportunity to bring a lot of supply into a market where there's growing demand and need for additional current supply. I don't know if you want to say anything else to that, Hugh.
No, this is working, yeah. That answered the question well. The voluntary carbon market, when we look at the voluntary carbon market rather than Corsia, exists because there's a gap between where we need to get to and what current compliance is doing. And that means that there is activity out there which is additional because it's not happening at the moment. And over time, it's natural that that should shift. So renewable energy prices come down, that's a good thing, but that means it's no longer additional for the carbon market. And as Stephen said, we're seeing growth in certain sectors, and my expectation is as prices grow, there's interest suddenly in new sectors which maybe weren't possible at lower prices, and so there will still be a space, but that space will kind of move higher up, and it'll be for higher hanging fruit over time. And so there will be kind of a continuation and an evolution in the types of activity which are supported through the voluntary market. And that's a good thing because that means that prices are falling, compliance is coming in, and what was done in the past is no longer additional because it's happening anyway. And I think that's positive. That's the way that I see it.
Yeah, thank you. Any further question? Please, sir.
I'm David Wayne. I'd like to stir up a little bit and suggest that it would be possible in principle for governments to say to fuel suppliers, you can sell all the aviation fuel you like, but for every ton of carbon that your aviation fuel will put into the atmosphere, you must demonstrate before you sell it that you have paid for a ton of carbon to be withdrawn. No, it might not be 1 ton, it might be 2 tons to take account of the other effects. This couldn't be done now. Perhaps at the moment 0.5% of aviation fuel could be neutralized, withdrawn by that mechanism. But if that target were set to start, say, in 5 years' time and then to step up year by year, I think the withdrawal technologies that are now becoming available would grow very rapidly. Now, I know I'm stirring a little bit, but what is your reaction to that?
Who would like to go first? Yeah, Jim.
Yeah. I think it's a brilliant thought that you have, and I mean, sure. If you see a trajectory over there, why don't you make a recommendation to the negotiators over there so that the governments can take this into account? I mean, that's actually something a point to start with, because if you start taxing something upfront, then the consumption can probably actually go down. So yeah, I'm with you on this.
I wouldn't necessarily argue that it would drive consumption down. It might.
It might.
But rather that aviation could then say we are generally carbon neutral, fly conscience clear. And I think it might be more politically saleable to the public at large, because you could say you're not paying some mysterious tax or offsetting whose impact you don't understand. Aviation is clearing up the rubbish that it dumps neatly and uniquely.
True.
I think there could be some value in that, especially if you target very robust removals and permanent removals, which today are quite expensive. So I'm not talking about, most nature-based removal projects, which are really non-permanent on the time scale that we're looking at for combustion of kerosene or any other fossil fuel. At the same time, I think governments really need to push for transformation inside sectors, right? We cannot continue business as usual in sectors, including in aviation, on the assumption that we can remove that CO2 forever. And there is a limit to storage, and we absolutely need to actually address in-sector emissions. And so I think maybe that could be part of the solution, what you're proposing, but I think it should come definitely with also a mandate and an obligation to produce alternative fuel, such as electrofuels. Because ultimately, while today these are very expensive and not ready to be scaled up, if we don't invest in that technology today, then we're not going to have it. And I think that's actually relevant for many of the so-called hard-to-abate sectors. These are not impossible to abate sectors. These are hard-to-abate sectors. The difference is hard-to-abate can change. If you say it's impossible, like there's some physical reason why you just can't avoid it, then there we're going to need removals for those. And I think that's probably the case maybe for a portion of agricultural emissions. But ultimately, we need to shift what is hard to abate. What is hard to abate today might not be hard to abate in 15 years, and we need to invest today in shifting that frontier.
Yeah. Accepted. If I may make one more comment, one could set up a competition between various schemes. Aviation fuel must either be neutralized by withdrawal, and there are robust withdrawal techniques now, thinking of direct air capture, and particularly biochar, which is ready. And if your part of your aviation fuel is sustainable, so-called, then you don't have to negate that. If you achieve reductions, again, you avoid negation. Anyway, I've occupied more than my fair share of time.
I mean,
So thank you for
it's
your
fundamentally a carbon accounting question, and how, for scope 3 emissions, which is what you're talking about for these energy companies, the use of the product sold is not currently, there is no science-based target program yet for oil and gas. It's gone through consultation, and hopefully by the end of this year, we will have a science-based target initiative approach for the oil and gas sector. That could help clarify a lot of how companies in the energy sector, oil and gas sector, can assign a science-based target and where scope 3 emissions gets claimed. Until then, it's being assigned into the direct emissions, scope 1 for the airlines, and it'd be really interesting to see how that responsibility can be shared, if it can be shared, to what extent the energy company or the oil and gas companies that are producing that fuel will claim ownership, and what percentage breakdowns might be. But I'd be very interested in kind of seeing that. But it's a carbon accounting issue. It's not a yeah.
Another comment comes from there. Can we help with Mike?
Hi, my name is Will Stevens from the UK NGO Blue Ventures. We run community-based conservation in the Southern Hemisphere, including in Madagascar, where we have a small voluntary carbon project under the Plan Vivo scheme. I wondered if any of you would be able to share reflections on measures either underway or that could come in the climate sector in the years ahead to improve access to the climate market for small projects. I really agree with your point earlier, Stephen, that there is a premium attached to forest credits. We work in mangroves, that being the big marine forest, and there's huge benefit there beyond just the carbon sequestration. But they're fragmented ecosystems and not generally as big as the big tracts that are featured in the sector so far. What is the sector doing, or can the sector do, to improve accessibility for smaller local projects that could benefit from quicker access to climate credits and finance?
There we are. I mean, from the gold standard perspective, we introduced a micro-scale scheme, which was an approach to try to allow kind of smaller scale projects to have greater access to the market. So making sure kind of all of the same quality principles are in place, but just some of the processes are streamlined where there's kind of activities are at a small level. But still, I mean, from my perspective, is even with that, it's a complicated process that you have to go through to get a program set up. And that's kind of how it should be, in a way, because you want to have those steps in place to make sure that projects are set up in the most robust way, but there are difficulties through that with having access for people who don't have resources behind them. So I think it's an issue which is an important one. And I mean, we've had conversations over the past year. We continuously have stakeholders coming to us interested in setting up projects, and we have some ways of supporting them, but not all ones. And I think there's an important point that you've got there around improving access for kind of smaller actors and more local projects. And it's something which we've tried in Gold Standard. We've probably not got perfect, but there's more that can be done there.
On the access part that you asked. So there's a tool, Open Forest Protocol. You should go and look at that one. What these guys are doing are basically compartmentalizing the entire MRV chain and getting access to your data, getting it verified separately. And so each of the expert in each of the domain, it's on blockchain tech. So it could be kind of interesting for you if you can just look that up. That can definitely get you some better access to the data, the information, the carbon credits, the carbon finance upfront or later on in terms of sale of carbon credits.
Thank you for your thoughts. If we don't have any further questions, I would like to conclude the session as we are coming to end for our slot. Thank you for audiences, and thank you for dear speakers for your thoughtful and very well-prepared presentations. You are almost welcome at Turkey Pavilions at Conference of Parties for use. Of course, I hope that we won't need any more COP in a near future, but which is not likely at all, I would say. So thank you for everyone. Yeah.